Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 ways to beat Pirate Warriors. Now, of course, if you've been playing Hearthstone at all lately, you have seen Pirate Warrior on the ranked ladder. It is a very dominant deck. It wins a lot of games. It's a very popular deck because it wins games so quickly, allowing players to climb up the ranked ladder fairly fast, and that's a pretty hated deck, to say the least, because most people interpret it as a deck that grants its players very easy wins, and it doesn't exactly require the most skill to find success. Now, I'm not here to debate that point, but I do know that there are a lot of people out there who hate playing against Pirate Warriors, and therefore hate Pirate Warriors, and they're looking for ways that they can beat Pirate Warriors on the ranked ladder, helping them rank up and defeat their nemesis in the process, right? So this list is designed to give you some gameplay tips that will specifically help you overcome Pirate Warriors on the ladder. Now, this is not a very simple list that says tech in Gluttonous Ooze, tech in Galactic Crawler, play a specific kind of class. That's far too easy and far too simple. I'm not telling you you have to play a certain way as far as what class or what cards to run in your list. This is more about in-the-game moments and decision-making and gameplay processes that will help you overcome Pirate Warriors once you've already entered that game and seen them on the ladder, almost regardless of what kind of class or cards you're running. These are more about general strategy than outside the game meta tips. So all of that said, let's go ahead and just jump into this list, starting off with my first tip for beating Pirate Warrior. And that first tip is that you have to aggressively mulligan for the answers that you need that are in your deck. Now, whether those are the tech cards I mentioned in the intro, or whether those are just the early game drops that you're going to need to keep up. For instance, if you're running Mage, you might need Mana Worm to get out there really quickly and trade into stuff. You might need Northshire Cleric if you're Priest. Those aren't tech cards, those are just the cards in your deck that are going to get you off to the fastest start and give you the answers that you need to keep up with the Pirate Warriors' super aggressive starts. So sometimes you just have to aggressively mulligan for those cards, and specifically those cards. In other words, if you have a really late game control style deck, you see a 3-drop in your opening hand, you might say, well, I better keep that 3-drop just so that I have some sort of early game card to play so that I don't fall too far behind. But that kind of thinking is a trap, because frankly, if the first thing you play is a 3-drop against Pirate Warrior, you're pretty much doomed anyway, and you're basically taking a card that is sort of halfway good enough for you to win and seems like a sort of safety bet or a last resort, when what you actually need to be doing is giving everything, all the cards in your mulligan, to draw into the perfect answers in that perfect early game curve. Because if you just kind of go halfsies and things that you think might be good enough, you're still just going to lose the game to Pirate Warrior. You're just going to do it slower. But what you need to be doing instead is going all in on that mulligan, trying to find the exact kinds of things you'll need to survive and win the game, so that you give yourself a slightly better chance to for sure win the game, instead of a slightly less bad chance to maybe hold on to the game and play to turn 6 or 7 before you die instead of turn 4 when you die. Because ultimately, that's just a slower way to lose, and that's not the most efficient way to use your time on the ranked ladder. So if your deck can just barely get by against Pirate Warrior, sometimes you just have to be super aggressive, look for the exact kinds of answers that you need to win the game, not just not lose the game. The next tip is that you should always be willing to give up what I call value for maximum tempo on the board. In other words, all kinds of decks have efficiency plays or value plays that do something really cool and valuable if you do a certain specific set of actions or do things in a certain order. For instance, if you think of Medivh's Valet and Secret Mage, to get the most value out of Medivh's Valet, you're often going to want to have a secret deployed and then play that card with the 3 damage battle cry. But if you're playing against a super hyper-aggressive deck like Pirate Warrior, sometimes you just can't afford to wait that long to get the maximum value from Medivh's Valet. For instance, if you don't have a 2-drop and there's no good ping target on board, you might just have to play the Medivh's Valet as a 2/3 minion to go out there and trade into the early stuff that Pirate Warrior has developed. Now, that is a terrible play for current value and future value, and frankly it's even a bad play for future tempo, because a 3 damage battle cry is good for tempo in the future, but you can't be willing to get all of that value on the back end against Pirate Warrior. Sometimes you have to be willing to get the tempo and the board presence and the initiative right now, and find other ways to get future value in the future, because you just won't necessarily have time to develop a secret and then play Medivh Valet, hope the secret sticks. Maybe you haven't drawn into a Kirin Mage to get the free secret. You have to just play it now and hope for the best later, because if you don't, you're just going to fall too far behind, and you don't necessarily have the catch-up mechanics in most decks to do that. Like, you don't necessarily have a big heal like you used to with Reno Jackson. In the past, you could probably fall behind a little bit, use a big AoE to clear, and then Reno your face to stabilize. That doesn't exist in standard format today, so instead you have to just do everything you can to stay caught up so that you can stabilize at a future point, and you just kind of have to trust in your draws and trust in your plays down the road that they're going to be enough to get you over the hump against Pirate Warrior to stabilize. Because if you wait too long, obviously you're just going to be dead and you're not going to be able to make those value plays down the road anyway. So always focus on tempo, getting as much mana and as much stats out onto the board in every single turn as you can, instead of trying to play for the ultimate sorts of value plays. In other words, Arcane Intellect, probably going to be way too slow in every single Pirate Warrior match, even if it gives you card advantage. Who cares? You have to play the secret, you have to play the empty Kirin Mage, you have to play stats and spells out onto the board that actively influence the game. You can't just keep playing for later against Pirate Warrior. There will not be a later. Moving on to my third tip, this is that you should always know what the maximum potential damage of a Pirate Warrior is going to be in a given turn, and then make your plays with that damage in mind. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you should always play around a Pirate Warrior's maximum damage. Sometimes you just kind of have to play to your outs and hope they don't have it. If they do have it, you might just be screwed anyway, so don't always play around it, but know what is capable and make plays with that in mind. For instance, if you know they can only put out 12 damage and you're at 18 health, then there's a good chance you might actually have more than 2 turns to survive, just because there's only a couple instances where one exact card gives pirates 6 damage. If that number goes up to 7, it's even higher because they don't have Mortal Strike buffed or Leroy. So you might actually have 3 turns to survive. And you can start to do math basically over multiple instances of a turn if you think about the number of cards they have in hand, how much mana is available. And doing those calculations can in turn really help you guide your lines of play. So in other words, do I need to do 5 damage to his face now so that I'm able to kill him in 2 turns before he kills me? Or do I need to continually keep trading into his minions while I find more answers? And whether it's over a single turn or over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 turns, if you can start to do that math and start to understand the limits and the outs that the Pirate Warrior itself has, then you can start to make plays. Sometimes you might have to gamble and hope to win a game sooner and make riskier plays because you know you're going to be dead in 2 turns anyway. Sometimes you might have a longer leash and can make more value-oriented plays. Basically, just having this number in the back of your head and constantly updating it throughout the course of the game gives you so much additional information and so much more decision-making power and influence in the game that you'll find yourself winning a couple games that you otherwise might have lost without actually knowing this. If you know their absolute max damage output is 10 damage for some reason next turn, because they have whatever magical combination of cards, you know they can only possibly do 10 damage. If you know you're at 11, you can just go face and ignore whatever other things they might have and just try to turn the corner and win the game on them. So just always be doing that math. In other words, you have to learn what pirate lists are out there and what's available and what cards they're likely to have, and understand what they've drawn, how much it cost, how many cards they have available, and you can do all that math and put yourself in a very powerful position by knowing these numbers. Up next at the number 4 spot is that you should try to keep pirate minions off the board as much as possible. There's a lot of different ways, really, I guess just a couple specific ways that warriors benefit from having those pirates on the board. Namely, there's the South Sea Captain, of course, which buffs pirates, and the more of them there are, the more value you're giving those buffs, and the harder they become to remove all of a sudden. But there's also the Bloodsail Cultist that whenever you have a pirate on board, it actually allows them to buff their weapon. So there's a lot of instances where I've seen people make inefficient trades plays that where they develop a minion as opposed to removing a minion that they had the option to remove, and then they end up getting punished because suddenly that South Sea Captain comes down, allows the patches to trade up, the Bloodsail Cultist comes down, allows the weapon to trade up and do stuff that you wouldn't expect, and gives the weapon extra damage, and suddenly you're in a whole different world of trouble than you were if you'd only made the decision to kill the minion instead of developing your own stuff, or just always focused on using that removal spell instead of playing a guy, or trading in a certain way that cleared the board as opposed to trading for the most value. There are multiple instances where you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you don't focus on keeping pirates off the board. Now, of course, there are times where you don't have to do that necessarily. If you know they only have 2 mana next turn, maybe they can't play the cultist or the captain, and there's less synergies available. But 99% of the time, in a lot of situations, if you know that they have some cards available or some way to benefit from those pirate synergy options, you should do as much as you can to keep those pirates off the board. Unless, of course, you can kill them or just win the game outright. But this is still something a lot of people miss, even though it's sort of simple in many ways. It's something you do need to think about constantly and make sure that you're checking this one off your list, because this isn't necessarily a high-minded extra strategy level that only smart people are going to see. It's one of those things you can occasionally forget about and not realize is happening and not realize that you failed, and then it suddenly turns a game in their favor and costs you a win that you otherwise had. And then finally, my 5th tip, I actually think this one might be the most important of all, and that's that sometimes you just have to know when to turn the corner. In other words, change your style of play and kill the pirate warrior instead of just defending yourself. Sometimes this goes to the extremes where I've seen people miss lethal against a pirate warrior because they're so focused on staying alive and trading into the pirate warrior's minions. That's an extreme example, right? If you've got lethal, obviously you need to be checking for that every single turn. Don't get so focused on your own life total that you forget the importance of the opponent's life total. So that's step number 1. Always confirm lethal and take it when you've got it. But it actually goes beyond that. There are often instances where you can set up 2-turn lethals, or sometimes even 3-turn lethals, as I teased in my 3rd tip, when knowing the total damage output of the warrior. Basically, there are points in every game once you've sort of halfway stabilized, and of course the pirate warrior can find more damage and still do crazy stuff, but there's a point where you have to realize, I need to beat him before he beats me. He is going to find the damage. It's inevitable. Maybe your deck doesn't have taunts, doesn't have healing, and you know there's another weapon coming. You know there's more charge minions coming. So eventually, if you take too long, he's going to kill you. It's just inevitable. And that means you sort of have to engage in a race. Not from turn 1 necessarily, but maybe on turn 4, turn 5, if you started to develop some minions, you're just sitting there waiting for him to hit you in the face with a big Arcanite Reaper. You have to realize, what can I do to maximize my chances of killing him before he kills me? And often there can be a lot of that same lethal math involved, where you kind of do the numbers over a couple turns. How long do I potentially have to live? How long can I kill him? Occasionally there's some extra math in there too with Mortal Strikes. Can I put him to 13 health so that he doesn't get a buffed Mortal Strike that doesn't kill me in turn? All of those things are really important to sort of master as well. But this tip is more about the top level of that, which is just knowing when you can stop making trades, stop making inefficient plays. In other words, when do you start frostbolting face instead of frostbolting a Bloodsail Raider to prevent damage? When do you send a fireball into the face instead of fireballing a Naga Corsair? It's not just Mage, of course. All kinds of decks have these questions and have answers to those questions that you'll learn as you start to play your deck and start to understand your damage output limits, your survivability limits, and you'll start to get a good feel and a good instinct for knowing when it's finally time to turn the corner and say, okay, dude, you're not going to win this game. I'm going to kill you first. Let's engage in just a very subtle race here that I think I'm very highly advantaged to win, and kill the warrior before they kill you. We've all seen warrior games where they just run out of gas and they concede and you're at 25 health. That's not what this is about, of course. This is about when they think they still have a chance, and you know that you have a good chance to win that race, and you understand that this is the point. I'm going to go all in. I'm going to kill them first, and they're not going to have time to kill me. And understanding that subtlety and finding that balance and learning those instincts. I know you can't necessarily learn instincts, but you kind of can in Hearthstone as you get a feel for these things. Will make you considerably better at beating Pirate Warrior, because you'll find there are those games here and there where this tip makes all the difference, and you realize you can win the race. Your deck does have the power to kill them as long as you play it in that way. And there you have it. Those are my tips for beating Pirate Warrior. I found a lot of success against Pirate Warrior, even in decks that aren't necessarily designed to beat it, by understanding how the matchup works and by following this advice. Now, of course, it does help to play Pirate Warrior if you want to beat Pirate Warrior, because you really do start to learn the limitations and the intricacies of the deck. So that's another tip I didn't include here. But even if it's just a couple days of research, it looks like Pirate Warrior is going to be around for a long time. So putting in that time to learn the deck by playing the deck doesn't necessarily make you evil. It just means you've scouted out your opponent, you've figured out the nemesis, and you're better armed and better equipped to beat them. So that's another tip. And then, of course, there are the tech cards and the meta reads that can help you beat Pirate Warrior and other aggressive decks too. So when you add all those things together, I think you're going to be really well armed to defeat the most evil deck on the ladder, as some people would put it. But I'm curious what you guys have to say. Do you have tips of your own, or there's some cool things you figured out as far as beating Pirate Warrior is concerned? I'd love to hear that take. On top of that, what other decks would you like to learn how to beat? I'm happy to make future videos in this vein, teaching how to beat other archetypal decks. So if there's something that's really got you down, you can't figure out strategies or tips to beat it, let me know in the comments below, and maybe there will be a video in the very near future with some tips from yours truly. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.